Picture this. You are crouched in the corner of a cramped stone cell beneath the amphitheater in Rome, 73 BC. Your wrists burn from iron shackles that have rubbed your skin raw, leaving red welts that sting with every shift of your weight. Around you, the air is thick with the smell of sweat, mold, and the acrid tang of fear. Dozens of men are pressed close in the darkness, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of their breath mingling in the stagnant underground air. Above your head, 50,000 voices roar like thunder, the cheers of a people who gather not for justice or truth, but for the theater of blood. Sand crunches and clatters in the arena above as gladiators clash, their blades ringing against shields, their cries echoing in the chambers beneath. The smell of blood drifts downward through iron grates, mixing with sawdust scattered to soak it up. You cannot see it, but you can hear it. Death is above you, waiting. Your name is Marcus, though that is the name Rome gave you. Once long ago you were called Cleomire, born in Thrace. A village child who ran through the hills, who hunted, who learned stories at the fire. But those memories feel like a dream, half lost after Roman legions dragged you in chains across half the known world. Now you are property. Tomorrow they will oil your body, put a sword in your hand you barely know how to hold, and shove you into the killing ground above. For the entertainment of strangers, your life will be wagered on the sand. And yet, tonight, something happens that shifts the air, that cracks the silence of despair. A gladiator named Spartacus begins to whisper in the darkness. At first, you think it is madness. Who dares whisper here, under the weight of chains, with death so close above? But his voice cuts through the fear. Come, steady, dangerous. He speaks not of escape, not of false hope, but of limits. He dares to suggest something that feels unthinkable, that even Rome, the empire of conquest and cruelty, has lines it cannot cross. Spartacus speaks of laws, of boundaries written not in compassion, but in stone and blood. He reminds those who listen that slaves, though branded as property, are still touched by protections carved into Roman legal codes, debated in marble courts, inscribed on bronze tablets. Even slaves, he whispers, have souls that cannot be owned. Even property has rights that cannot be stripped away. The words are dangerous. They are seeds dropped into soil poisoned by fear. And yet, in the shadows, those words spark something. For the men huddled there, men who once had names, lands, families, suddenly the idea forms. Rome is not limitless. The chains that bind them are not only iron. They are law, custom, economy, and fear. But if there are lines Rome itself has drawn, then perhaps those lines can also be crossed, broken, shattered. To understand these whispers, we must follow them into the world that forged them. The shadowed world of Roman slavery. A world where men and women were stripped of identity, yet never entirely of humanity. Where power proclaimed itself absolute, yet revealed cracks in its own foundations. This is not a journey for the faint of heart. We are not tourists in ruins, collecting curiosities of the past. We are archaeologists of suffering, digging through fragments of law, scraps of papyrus, scarred stone, and haunted memory. The question before us is as simple as it is terrifying. What could masters not do to slaves? The answer will not comfort us, but it will reveal the truth of how Rome maintained its empire of bondage, and how even within absolute domination, limits betray the fragility of power. Rome in the 1st century BC was a machine for producing slaves, a factory of human misery that stretched across continents. Every conquest fed the beast. Every victory filled the markets with flesh. But before we descend fully into that machine, pause here in the darkness, where Spartacus's whisper still lingers. Listen to the idea that power, no matter how immense, is never without boundary. That even in Rome, the greatest enslaver the world had yet known, absolute authority was forced to admit its own weakness. It is here, in these whispers, that rebellion is born. Rome in the 1st century BC was not merely a city. It was a hunger, a beast that devoured nations and spat out slaves. Every conquest, every campaign, every victory filled its veins with new human captives, feeding a system that was as essential to Roman survival as water to a river. The Republic and later the Empire thrived not simply on gold, not simply on trade, but on flesh. When Pompey crushed the pirates of Cilicia in 67 BC, he sold 20,000 captives in the markets of Delos in a single day. The island had already earned a grim reputation. It was said a slave ship could dock, unload, and within hours every man, woman, and child would be auctioned and scattered, disappearing into households and fields across the Mediterranean. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was even more catastrophic. 1 million Celts killed, another million enslaved. Chains stretched from the forests of Gaul to the marble courtyards of Rome, each link hammered by conquest. The heartbeat of Rome was the slave market. Its rhythm was the shuffle of bare feet on marble, the crack of whips, the bargaining cries of merchants beneath statues of gods who looked on with carved indifference. To walk through the city was to see slavery everywhere, though rarely acknowledged by the free citizens who benefited from it. In a wealthy Roman household, slaves were invisible until needed. They cooked meals that arrived steaming, they emptied chamber pots long before anyone noticed the smell, they copied manuscripts that senators quoted as if from memory. Some taught children, some carried litters through crowded streets, others, forced companions, warmed their masters' beds. A slave could be a Thracian gladiator, a Greek tutor, a Syrian scribe, a Germanic bodyguard. Each one, though stripped of freedom, carried with them fragments of their homeland, languages, songs, recipes, prayers, that would seep into Rome itself. Without slaves, Rome would not have starved in a week. It would have collapsed entirely. The aqueducts, the villas, the bustling forums, all ran on the invisible machinery of human bondage. And yet, even in this machine, rules existed. Rome prided itself on law. It was the glue of empire, the language through which power justified itself. Roman elites often declared their power absolute, but they lived in a society where order, precedent, and reputation mattered even more than brute strength. A master could command much, but he could not command without restraint. The first and perhaps most surprising limit was this: a Roman master could not legally kill his slave without cause. At first glance, this sounds merciful, almost humane. But in truth, it was not born from compassion. It was born from economics. A slave was property, and property was valuable. A skilled slave, a Greek philosopher who educated young nobles, a physician with healing knowledge, a cook who knew the secrets of spices, could cost more than a year's wages for a skilled free craftsman. To kill such an investment casually was like throwing gold into a fire. Waste was not merely frowned upon, it was a vice that offended Roman sensibilities, almost as much as cowardice. This boundary, fragile as it was, reveals something profound. Even in Rome's cruelty, limits were acknowledged. Not to protect the enslaved, but to preserve the machine. For a system that sought to turn people into objects, Rome could never fully escape the fact that these objects thought, bled, and remembered. The irony was staggering. Rome's entire empire rested on human bondage, yet within that bondage lurked rules that betrayed Rome's fear. Fear of chaos, fear of rebellion, fear of the economic ruin that might come if masters were allowed to kill without reason. A society that claimed absolute domination over others had already admitted, in its own laws, that absolute power was impossible to sustain. And so, we arrive at the grotesque paradox. Rome enslaved millions, yet Rome itself was enslaved by its need to control how that power was exercised. Every law written to restrain a master was also a confession that slaves mattered, not as humans, but as cogs in a system too delicate to survive unregulated cruelty. Here, at the very foundation of Roman slavery, we see the contradiction that would haunt the empire. For if masters could not do everything they pleased, then even slaves, broken, shackled, sold, existed within boundaries that suggested something terrifying to those in power. The oppressed were never entirely powerless. The idea seems absurd at first glance, that in a world where men and women were bought and sold like cattle, Rome dared to tell masters there were limits to their power of life and death. But this was the reality. A master could not simply wake up in a foul mood and slaughter his slave for amusement. To Roman society, that was not authority, it was chaos. This restraint was not rooted in compassion. It was economics. Every slave was an investment, a sum of money tied to flesh. Some cost as little as a few denarii, field hands pulled from war-torn provinces. Others were worth fortunes, trained gladiators, exotic dancers, skilled craftsmen, physicians, scribes. The death of a slave without cause was not viewed as murder, but as destruction of property, no different from smashing a finely wrought bronze vessel or burning a chest of silver coins. To Romans, waste was a vice. The culture prized efficiency, discipline, and calculated control. A general who squandered soldiers in reckless battle was condemned. A master who squandered slaves in senseless killings was seen with equal disgust. Wealth and reputation were inseparable in Roman society, and a man known for reckless cruelty could find himself excluded from business, shunned in political circles, whispered about in forums where reputation was currency. The consequences might not be immediate, but they were real. Beneath this logic lay a grim moral calculus. Rome's ruling class knew that fear was a tool, but like any weapon, it had to be used with precision. Kill too few slaves and they might grow bold. Kill too many, and there would be no one left to cook, to till fields, to raise children, to teach heirs. Unrestrained murder would unravel the delicate balance that kept millions in chains. Terror worked best when it was predictable. The lash had to sting, but never without reason, at least in the eyes of Roman order. So Roman law developed categories of justified killings: theft, attempted escape, striking a free person, sexual impropriety, certain acts of defiance. Each one carved into precedent, each one designed not to protect the enslaved, but to reassure masters that discipline had rules, that terror was not anarchy but policy. Killing had to serve a purpose: punishment, deterrence, or the removal of a threat. Anything outside that framework was condemned as waste, disorder, or worse, weakness. This distinction was not merely legal. It was cultural. Roman society revered gravitas, the virtue of seriousness, self-control, dignity. A master who slaughtered slaves without reason revealed himself as a man ruled by impulse, not by discipline. And a man without discipline had no claim to Roman virtue. Stories circulated of masters who indulged in senseless cruelty, only to find themselves ridiculed, abandoned by allies, even prosecuted for disturbing the peace, or for property destruction. Such trials were rare, but the threat of them loomed like a shadow over the reckless. Still, these limits did not grant the enslaved true safety. They lived under a system where their worth was measured in coin, not in blood. A Greek tutor could be spared because he was profitable. A field hand might be executed without hesitation if his labor was easily replaced. In this twisted equation, protection came not from humanity but from productivity. And yet, even this thin protection mattered. It revealed something profound. Rome, for all its claims of absolute authority, recognized that unchecked power over human lives was dangerous, even to itself. A master might rule his household like a king, but if he killed without reason, he risked disrupting the very order that allowed Rome to function. It was a contradiction that could never be fully resolved. Rome insisted slaves were property, yet treated them differently from objects of bronze or stone. Because unlike those objects, slaves could think, could resist, could break. A chair would not poison its owner. A jug would not strangle a sleeping child. But a slave pushed past despair might. And so, Rome wrapped cruelty in law, hiding brutality behind logic and precedent. But in doing so, it admitted an uncomfortable truth: power that must be limited is never truly absolute. Even in bondage, the enslaved carried a shadow of influence, a reminder that Rome's domination was not invulnerable. This is why Spartacus's whispers carried such danger. To slaves huddled in the darkness, the knowledge that Rome itself had drawn boundaries was not just law, it was hope. For if Rome could not kill without reason, perhaps there were other cracks in the system, other limits waiting to be tested. And in the years to come, tested they would be. In Rome, chains were not only made of iron. They were also forged in the realm of belief. Religion was everywhere, from the shrines at street corners to the vast marble temples that loomed over the Forum. For the free, it was a way of honoring the gods who, they believed, safeguarded Rome's destiny. For the enslaved, religion became something far more complex. A weapon, a shield, a whispered prayer in the night, a code of survival. Masters used religion to control. Every Roman household kept a shrine to the Lares and Penates, spirits of hearth and ancestors. Slaves were expected to participate in daily offerings, lighting incense, pouring wine, kneeling before the flames. The act bound them to the family, a ritualized reminder that their fate was tied to the master's fortune. Some masters even insisted that slaves join in public festivals and sacrifices, to demonstrate loyalty not only to household gods but to Jupiter himself, father of Rome. Yet within these rituals, slaves carved out secret spaces. In the murmured prayers, they remembered their own gods: the Thracian horsemen, the Celtic spirits of river and grove, the Syrian goddess Atargatis, the Egyptian Isis. Rome tolerated many cults, and in that tolerance slaves found room to preserve fragments of their own identities. To light a candle for Jupiter might be obedience. To whisper a prayer to Isis under one's breath was defiance disguised as piety. For some, faith became a lifeline. A Gallic woman, torn from her village and forced into servitude in Campania, might continue to call on the spirits of her ancestors in the quiet of the night. A Greek tutor, beaten for a mistake in a lesson, might whisper hymns to Apollo, the god of wisdom and healing. For these men and women, religion was a reminder that their humanity was not erased, that beyond the Roman gaze there was still meaning, still dignity. But faith could also be dangerous. Slaves gathering for secret rites raised suspicion. The Bacchanalian affair of 186 BC was Rome's nightmare in miniature. Foreign cults, nocturnal meetings, rituals that blurred the lines between worship and rebellion. The Senate cracked down brutally, seeing in these gatherings not only immorality but conspiracy. Slaves who worshipped too openly, who formed bonds too tightly around shared gods, were accused of plotting revolt. Faith then was tolerated only when it remained a private whisper, safe, invisible, non-threatening. And yet, despite Rome's attempts at control, religion seeped through cracks in the empire. It was among slaves and the poor that new gods often took root. The cult of Isis spread from Egypt into Roman port cities, embraced by those on society's margins. The cult of Mithras, with its secret initiations and underground chambers, attracted soldiers and slaves alike. In these faiths, the enslaved found belonging, dignity, and promises of salvation that Roman law could never grant. Later, in the shadows of this vast religious landscape, Christianity would find its earliest converts among the enslaved. To men and women who were denied names, families, and freedom, the message was radical, that in the eyes of God, slave and master stood equal. That suffering was not meaningless. That chains on earth could not bind the soul. For now, in the world of Spartacus, Christianity was still a whisper decades away. But the principle was already alive. Faith gave the enslaved something Rome could never fully strip away. It gave them an inner space, untouchable, where they could endure the lash, the marketplace, the arena, and still believe that life meant more than what Rome dictated. For masters, religion was a tool of cohesion. For slaves, it was both compliance and quiet rebellion. The same incense smoke that curled upward to Jupiter carried with it unspoken prayers to other gods, gods of resistance, gods of memory, gods who might one day deliver them from chains. In the silence of Roman nights, after the feasts ended and the masters slept, slaves would gather in kitchens, in courtyards, in cellars. They would sing softly, whispering names of gods Rome did not know, telling stories of creation and freedom. The masters believed religion bound slaves tighter to the household. In truth, it also bound them to one another. Among the millions in chains, one man's name endures above all others: Spartacus. A Thracian by birth, perhaps once a soldier, perhaps once free, his exact origins blur in the mists of history. What we know is this: he was captured, enslaved, and sold to a gladiatorial school in Capua. There, alongside dozens of other men condemned to fight for Roman entertainment, he became a weapon sharpened for spectacle. Gladiator schools were prisons disguised as training camps. Stone walls, barred gates, armed guards, they were fortresses of brutality. The men inside were not merely trained to fight, they were conditioned to die for the amusement of crowds. But gladiators were unlike field hands or household servants. They were fighters, fed to be strong, drilled to kill. In them simmered a unique danger. Men who had lost everything yet still retained the skill to strike back. Spartacus was one of these men. To Rome he was property. To the other gladiators he was something more. A leader who carried himself with calm authority, a man who could see beyond the arena's sand. When he spoke, men listened. Not because he promised glory but because he understood what it meant to be broken. In 73 BC the whispers began. A plan to escape. A desperate strike against their keepers. At first only a few joined. The scheme seemed impossible. What hope could slaves, armed with kitchen knives and spits from the cookhouse, have against trained Roman guards? Yet Spartacus persuaded them. Not with dreams of conquest but with the raw truth: die in the arena or die fighting for freedom. Between the certainty of death and the chance of it, the choice became clear. 70 men escaped that night, bursting from Capua's gladiatorial school, seizing wagons of weapons meant for others, cutting down the guards who pursued them. It was supposed to be a small, doomed rebellion, the kind Rome had crushed countless times before. But Spartacus's revolt was different. The fire caught. Slaves from villas and fields heard of the uprising and flocked to him. At first they came ragged, half-starved, armed with farming tools. Then they came in waves: Gauls, Thracians, Germans, Syrians. By the thousands they joined, and then tens of thousands. Within months, Spartacus commanded an army. Some accounts place the number as high as 70,000. Men and women, fighters and families, all drawn to the hope of breaking chains. What Rome faced was no longer a band of fugitives. It was a movement. Spartacus proved himself not only a gladiator but a general. He defeated Roman forces sent against him again and again, ambushing legions, slipping away into mountains, turning slave rabble into disciplined fighters. For 2 years he humiliated the Republic, marching up and down the Italian peninsula, leaving senators trembling in their marble halls. And yet, Spartacus was no conqueror in the Roman mold. He did not seek to replace the Republic with a throne of his own. His aim, so far as we can tell, was freedom. His army spoke of escape, of returning to their homelands, of crossing the Alps and disappearing into lands Rome did not control. But freedom was not so simple. Rome was vast, its reach long. There was no easy way out. In the end, Rome answered with overwhelming force. The general Marcus Licinius Crassus took command, and with brutal efficiency he trapped Spartacus's army in southern Italy. The final battle was chaos, slaves fighting to the last, Spartacus himself reportedly cutting down enemies until he was surrounded, refusing to flee, dying sword in hand. His body was never found. Rome's vengeance was merciless. 6,000 captured slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road for miles, a grotesque warning to anyone who might dream of rebellion. The message was clear: Rome could bend, Rome could bleed, but Rome would not break. And yet, Spartacus did not vanish. His revolt lived on in memory, in whispered stories, in the uneasy truth Rome could never erase, that even millions in chains could rise, and that even the mightiest empire could tremble before men it once called property. Spartacus's rebellion did not end slavery, but it exposed its fragility. It showed that the system Rome depended on, the machine of bondage, was never invulnerable. Beneath the lash, beneath the law, beneath the rituals of control, there was always resistance. Sometimes silent, sometimes violent, but always present. Rome would endure for centuries more. But in every villa, in every marketplace, in every whispered prayer to foreign gods, the memory of Spartacus lingered. Not as a general who won, but as proof that even in chains, the human will to resist could not be extinguished. Not every slave could be Spartacus. Most did not have the weapons, the opportunity, or the sheer desperation to rise in open revolt. For the vast majority, survival meant something different, not raising an army but finding ways to endure. Yet even endurance could be rebellion, subtle and quiet, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Rome's system depended on obedience. Every field harvested, every pot fired, every account tallied, every meal cooked was the labor of enslaved hands. And wherever a system demands perfect compliance, cracks appear. Slaves found those cracks and widened them, not with swords but with delay, mischief, and quiet sabotage. A field hand might accidentally drop a tool, slowing the harvest by minutes that added up to hours. A household servant might water down the wine just enough to dull its flavor, a small insult disguised as clumsiness. A scribe could mistakenly miss a line in an account, forcing his master to waste time correcting the error. These acts were rarely enough to provoke death, but enough to assert that they were not machines. They had will, however constrained. Others resisted by claiming small pieces of identity. A Thracian slave might sing the songs of his homeland while grinding grain. A Syrian woman might teach her child her native tongue, even when forbidden. These acts, invisible to Roman law, were profound. Rome declared that slavery erased a man's past and bound him entirely to his master's will. By preserving language, memory, and custom, slaves defied that erasure. They remained who they were. There were also forms of resistance that Rome feared deeply: poisoning. Whispered in countless sources, never proven but always suspected, was the idea that slaves might slip herbs or venom into their master's cup. Even the suspicion of it created paranoia. A wealthy Roman might dine in splendor, yet eye his cupbearer with unease, wondering whether loyalty or quiet vengeance filled his goblet. Flight was another form of resistance. Escaping slaves, called fugitivi, were so common that Rome built an entire legal and economic structure around hunting them down. Notices of runaways were posted in marketplaces, describing scars, accents, skills. Some fugitives were caught quickly, beaten or branded with an F for fugitivus. Others vanished into the countryside, blending with shepherds, bandits, or rebels. For those who succeeded, flight was the ultimate act of defiance, a refusal to remain property. But perhaps the most dangerous form of everyday resistance was solidarity. Slaves formed bonds, families, communities, even when law denied them the right. A master might separate spouses, sell children, forbid gatherings. Still, enslaved men and women carved out moments together. Secret marriages, hidden baptisms into foreign cults, lullabies sung in languages Rome tried to erase. Every bond was a quiet rebellion against the system that sought to isolate and divide. To Roman eyes, these acts might seem small, barely worth notice. But in truth, they were survival strategies, and survival itself was resistance. Rome's system thrived on reducing people to tools, to instruments of labor. Each act of delay, each whispered story, each stolen moment of joy reminded the enslaved, and Rome itself, that they were still human, not merely property. It was not always dramatic. There were no banners, no battle cries. But every broken tool, Every false mistake, every child who learned a forbidden song was a rebellion written in miniature. Rome could crucify 6,000 along the Appian Way, but it could not crucify every silence, every memory, every act of endurance. And in that endurance lay the deepest challenge to Roman slavery, the truth that even when bodies were bound, spirits could resist. Rome ruled through violence, but violence alone could never command total submission. Resistance seeped through every crack, unseen, unstoppable, waiting. Slavery was the foundation of Rome, and most Romans accepted it as natural, inevitable, and divinely sanctioned. Yet in the shadows of marble temples and bustling forums, a few voices wondered, was it right? Was it just? The loudest were not politicians or generals, they had too much to lose. Instead, it was philosophers, poets, and moralists who dared to tug at the edges of the system, even as they benefited from it. Their words did not topple slavery, but they reveal that even in antiquity, Rome's conscience was not entirely silent. Take Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and tutor of Nero. Seneca owned slaves himself, yet his writings are full of unease. He scolded masters who beat their slaves for minor faults, reminding them that a slave is a man just as you are. He advised kindness, even companionship, declaring, "They are slaves, but they are also men." To a Roman audience, this was radical, not because it rejected slavery but because it dared to call the enslaved human beings with moral worth. Then there was Epictetus, whose very life embodied the paradox. Born a slave in Phrygia, lame from a master's cruelty, Epictetus won his freedom and became one of the most famous Stoic teachers of his age. His philosophy carried the mark of his past. He taught that true freedom lies in the mind, that no master can chain the soul. To his students, many of them elite Romans, he was living proof that a slave was not merely property but a philosopher, an equal in wisdom. Poets too let the unease slip into verse. Horace, who grew up the son of a freedman, wrote warmly of the dignity of modest living, hinting at respect for those who labored without wealth. Juvenal, sharper and more cynical, mocked masters who mistreated their servants, exposing the cruelty as both shameful and absurd. Satire became a mirror. Rome laughed, but the laughter carried discomfort. Even law carried whispers of doubt. While most statutes reinforced the master's power, occasional reforms hinted at restraint. A law under Emperor Claudius declared that if a master abandoned a sick slave to die, the slave would be freed if he recovered. Later, Antoninus Pius ruled that killing a slave without cause could be treated as homicide. These laws did not dismantle slavery, but they betrayed cracks in Rome's certainty. For if slaves were truly nothing more than tools, why protect them at all? Still, for every philosopher who urged kindness, there were countless others who defended the lash. Aristotle, centuries earlier, had declared some men natural slaves, born to serve. Many Romans clung to that belief, wrapping their empire's brutality in the cloak of philosophy. To challenge slavery was not only to challenge tradition, but to challenge Rome itself. And so the uneasy conscience never became a movement. It remained scattered words in scrolls, scattered reforms in law, scattered sympathies whispered behind closed doors. Slavery endured because Rome's economy, politics, and identity were entwined with it too deeply to unravel. Yet the existence of those doubts matters. They show that even at the height of Rome's power, when slavery was unquestioned by most, some could see through the illusion. Some recognized the humanity beneath the chains. Some dared to imagine, however faintly, a Rome that did not stand upon the backs of the enslaved. For the slaves themselves, these doubts rarely brought relief. A kinder master was still a master. A law against murder did not erase the daily humiliation of servitude. But in philosophy classrooms, in poems, in debates at the baths, Rome revealed its guilty secret. That deep down, even those who owned slaves could not silence the suspicion that slavery was wrong. For centuries, slavery powered Rome's rise. But empires change, and so too did the machinery of bondage. By the later empire, the system that once seemed eternal began to bend, reshaping into something both familiar and new. The shift was not born of mercy. Rome did not suddenly grow a conscience. Instead, the very conditions that once fed slavery, war, conquest, expansion, began to dry up. The empire stopped growing, its borders hardened. Fewer prisoners of war marched in chains to the markets of Rome. Without the steady flow of captives from foreign campaigns, the supply of slaves dwindled. At the same time, the empire groaned under crisis. Plagues swept through cities. Barbarians pressed against the frontiers. Taxes soared. Landowners, desperate to keep fields productive, turned not only to slaves but to a new kind of worker, the colonists. Unlike slaves, coloni were technically free but bound to the land they worked. They could not easily leave, and their children inherited the same ties. Over time, this blurred the line between slavery and serfdom, foreshadowing the feudal systems of medieval Europe. The economy shifted too. Urban slavery declined as cities shrank. Villas in the countryside became the beating heart of production, sprawling estates where mixed labor forces, slaves, freedmen, coloni, worked side by side. Masters no longer relied on endless chains of new captives. Instead, they sought stability, binding workers to the soil, ensuring that fields would not lie empty even when wars ceased. Law followed suit. Emperors from Diocletian to Constantine issued decrees that locked coloni to estates, restricted their movement, and tied them to their landlords. What had once been the open brutality of slavery transformed into a quieter but equally binding dependence. Rome's economy no longer rested only on the whip. It now leaned on law, custom, and debt to keep labor in place. Religion added another layer. By the 4th century, Christianity had risen from a persecuted sect to the empire's official faith. The message of Christianity was complex. It preached the equality of souls before God, yet did not abolish slavery. Bishops urged masters to treat slaves with kindness, and slaves to obey their masters, promising spiritual reward in place of earthly justice. For some, this softened the cruelty of bondage. For others, it sanctified it, giving divine legitimacy to human chains. By the twilight of the empire, slavery remained, but it was not the same as in the days of Spartacus. Rome no longer marched endless columns of captives into the forum to be sold. The spectacle of gladiators had faded. Instead, the empire managed its labor through contracts, taxes, and laws that bound people to land and duty. Slavery did not disappear, but it melted into other forms, harder to see but no less restrictive. And yet, even as the old order shifted, the shadow of Roman slavery remained immense. Its legacy would echo into the medieval world and beyond, shaping the very idea that some people could be owned, bound, or controlled by others. The system's form changed, but the logic of domination endured. Rome's empire fell in the West in the 5th century, but slavery outlived Rome. It adapted, it persisted, it traveled. And long after the marble had crumbled and the legions had vanished, the Roman way of slavery still haunted Europe's fields, laws, and consciences. Rome collapsed in the West, its legions scattered, its emperors forgotten. But slavery did not fall with it. Instead, the Roman model of bondage spread like a stain across centuries, seeping into the very foundations of Europe and beyond. When medieval Europe took shape, it inherited not only Rome's roads and laws, but also its memory of owning human beings. Direct chattel slavery declined in many regions, replaced by serfdom, a softer mask over the same idea. Serfs were not called slaves, but they were bound to the soil, unable to leave without their lord's consent. This was no accident. It was the logical evolution of the Roman colony, those late imperial workers tied to the land. Rome had planted the seed, and the Middle Ages harvested it. The Church, too, inherited Rome's contradictions. Christianity had once preached to slaves in secret, offering spiritual equality under Christ. But as it became Europe's dominant religion, it sanctified hierarchy. Church fathers cited Roman law when defending slavery, declaring it part of the fallen world's order. Bishops and monasteries owned slaves and serfs alike, inheriting both souls and bodies as part of their wealth. Even as the Church spoke of freedom in the next life, it used Roman logic to justify bondage in this one. The legacy reached further still. In the Mediterranean, where trade linked Christian and Muslim worlds, slavery flourished across cultural lines. Arabs, Byzantines, and Latin kingdoms alike trafficked in human beings, often reviving Roman practices in new forms. From Sicily to Constantinople, from Moorish Spain to Crusader states, Rome's blueprint endured. And centuries later, when Europeans launched voyages of conquest across oceans, they drew not only on Roman ships and Roman law but on Roman memory. The great plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas, vast estates worked by enslaved Africans, echoed the latifundia of ancient Italy. Masters in the New World read Roman texts, admired Roman order, and in some cases explicitly invoked Rome as a precedent for owning others. In their eyes, history itself justified the trade in flesh. Even the language bore Rome's mark. The word slave comes from Slav, a people so often enslaved in medieval Europe that their name became the very definition of bondage. Yet behind that medieval transformation lay Rome's practice, its normalization of human ownership, its idea that some were born to command and others to serve. Rome's slavery, then, was not an ancient curiosity sealed in marble ruins. It was a template. It was memory, law, and precedent. Every later system of bondage, from serfdom to the Atlantic slave trade, carried echoes of Rome's foundations. Rome had not invented slavery, but it gave it scale, permanence, and legitimacy. It made it a pillar of civilization rather than a temporary consequence of war. And in this, Rome's greatest crime was not only what it did to millions in its own time, but what it left behind. The cruelty of the empire lived on in the societies that followed, shaping centuries of oppression long after Rome itself had burned.